I have observed, not as a politician, but as a doctor of the soul, that the greatest threat to the individual is the surrender of thought to the collective. Mass psychology, though often clothed in the language of progress, is a regression of the psyche, a retreat from consciousness into the seductive safety of the herd. It is in the crowd that man forgets himself, abandons responsibility, and permits his shadow to act in the guise of moral consensus. I do not bring warnings from newspapers or ideologies, but from the unconscious itself. Today, I invite you to examine not only the external world, but the subtle forces that shape human behavior and masse the archetypal energies that awaken in times of crisis, fear, and conformity. For if we do not make the unconscious conscious, it will rule us, and we shall call it history. Asterisk in times of collective tension, whether political upheaval, social unrest, or technological acceleration, Carl Jung observed something deeply troubling, the disappearance of the individual. He called this phenomenon the loss of individual identity within the crowd. To Jung, the crowd was not merely a gathering of people, it was a psychic force. It was the manifestation of something ancient, something that transcended logic, morality, and even personal will. When a man merges into a crowd, he does not merely act alongside others, he becomes someone else. Or more accurately, he becomes no one. The thinking, discerning, responsible self is surrendered to something more primitive, more instinctual, and less accountable. The crowd permits what the soul might resist. It encourages what the conscience would question. In it, the individual trades the burden of thought for the comfort of agreement. Jung saw this clearly in the rise of totalitarian regimes, in the fervor of revolutions, and even in modern democracies consumed by populism. But this was not merely a political concern, it was a psychological warning. The individual psyche is the seat of consciousness, of meaning, of divine encounter. When that psyche is absorbed into a collective, something essential is lost. Not only is the unique perspective of the individual silenced, but so too is their capacity for moral judgment. The crowd does not think, it reacts. The crowd does not evaluate, it amplifies. And it is in this amplification that Jung saw the seeds of destruction. For once man no longer sees himself as a moral agent, but merely as part of a movement, he becomes capable of things that he would otherwise never imagine. He can persecute, he can cancel, he can kill not as himself, but as a voice in the chorus. Jung believed that the unconscious plays a central role in this. The unconscious, when left unexamined, does not remain neutral. It is not an empty space, it is full of forgotten desires, unspoken fears, and archetypal energies. In the crowd, the unconscious rises to the surface, it animates slogans, it charges emotions, and it grants legitimacy to the irrational. And because the individual no longer stands as a reflective being, the unconscious contents are not filtered, they are expressed raw, in a storm of collective agreement. This is why Jung was deeply concerned about mass movements that lacked introspection. Without psychological insight, without the courage to examine the darkness within, the crowd becomes a vehicle for projection. Whatever the individual fears or hates within himself, he now sees in the other, and with the crowd's blessing, he attacks it. This is why identity becomes fluid and fragile within the mass. The person is no longer a soul made in the image of God, with responsibility for his actions. He is now a role, a protester, a patriot, a victim, a warrior. These identities are not rooted in inner truth, but imposed by the collective script. Jung saw how people, under the pressure of groupthink, could adopt entire ideologies that were alien to their true nature, simply because it gave them a place in the psychic organism of the group. The danger is that once you become what the group wants you to be, you can no longer become what God intended you to be. The loss of individual identity in the crowd is often disguised as empowerment. The collective promises belonging, strength, moral clarity. But these gifts are illusions if they cost you your conscience. Jung did not argue against community or collaboration. But he warned against identification. To identify with the crowd is to dissolve the self into the collective unconscious. And in doing so, the capacity for reflection, humility, and repentance is lost. The individual no longer asks, "Is this true for me?" He only asks, "Is this acceptable to them?" Mass psychology has always had the appearance of moral conviction, but Jung saw that it is rarely born from the higher centers of the soul. It is not the fruit of spiritual insight, but the reaction of the herd instinct. It moves by contagion, not contemplation. In such a climate, independent thought is treated as betrayal. Nuance is seen as weakness, and conscience becomes dangerous. It is precisely here that Jung believed the role of the individuated self was most needed. The person who has faced his unconscious, who has wrestled with his own darkness, who refuses to scapegoat others for his internal conflict, that person becomes the light in a darkened culture. But such a person cannot arise from the crowd. He must first separate himself from it, not in arrogance, but in courage. The loss of individual identity in mass psychology is a psychic event. It is not merely about behavior, it is about the fragmentation of the soul. When a person becomes indistinguishable from the ideology they've absorbed, they are no longer relating to reality. They are now living inside a myth designed not by their own journey, but by the collective's unconscious projections. Jung saw this myth-making as both powerful and perilous. It could unify, but it could also blind. It could motivate, but it could also manipulate. For this reason, he believed that every individual must reclaim their inner voice, their symbolic life, their sacred responsibility to remain awake even when the rest of the world is chanting in unison. When mass psychology takes hold, history shows us that atrocities follow not because evil men rise, but because ordinary men fall. They fall into forgetting. They fall into the convenience of agreement. They fall into the unconscious, and once there, they lose the capacity to say no not only to the group, but to themselves. This is why Jung's psychology is not simply therapeutic, it is prophetic. It calls each man and woman to remember who they are apart from the crowd, apart from the ideology, apart from the tribal name they've been given. It calls them to face the terror of standing alone, if it means standing in truth. It calls them to recognize that salvation is not collective, it is always individual. It is the soul, and not the system, that must be redeemed, and the first step toward that redemption is the reawakening of the self within the sleeping body of the crowd. Carl Jung understood that the unconscious mind was not a passive reservoir of forgotten thoughts or childhood memories, it was a living, dynamic force that influenced human behavior in powerful, often invisible ways. When it came to the phenomenon of mass psychology, Jung observed that the unconscious manipulation of the masses was one of the most dangerous and underestimated realities in modern society. The unconscious does not simply reside within the individual, it extends its reach into the collective, becoming a force that can shape entire cultures, movements, and historical moments. In times of unrest or fear, these unconscious forces do not remain dormant, they erupt with archetypal power, taking control of thought, speech, and action. Often without the awareness of those being influenced, the crowd becomes possessed, not by reason or truth, but by ideas whose roots are deeper than logic and older than civilization. One of the most insidious elements of this unconscious manipulation is that it often masquerades as enlightenment or moral righteousness. Jung warned that when people are not conscious of their own inner conflicts, projections take over. The personal shadow, which is the part of the psyche that contains repressed desires, fears, and unacceptable traits, is no longer faced internally, it is cast outward onto others. But in a mass setting, this projection is amplified. Entire groups begin to see their enemies not as human beings with complexity, but as embodiments of evil, ignorance, or danger. This is no accident. It is the unconscious mind organizing itself into mythic structure, dividing the world into heroes and villains, saviors and threats, light and dark, so that individuals within the group can feel unified, justified, and emotionally secure without needing to take responsibility for their own inner fragmentation. Jung emphasized that true evil does not always come from conscious malevolence. More often, it arises from unconsciousness. When people stop reflecting, when they stop examining their own motives and beliefs, they become instruments of forces they do not understand. Political ideologies, religious fervor, social movements all can be hijacked by unconscious content that drives people to act not as moral agents, but as archetypal roles. The revolutionary becomes the destroyer, the reformer becomes the tyrant, the activist becomes the persecutor. These transformations do not require deliberate deception. They occur naturally when individuals lose contact with the inner self and become possessed by collective fantasies. The crowd is not necessarily evil in intent, but it becomes dangerous because it acts without consciousness. It is moved by instinct, image, and emotional contagion, not by reasoned thought. The unconscious manipulation of the masses is made easier in the modern world because of the saturation of symbols, slogans, and media. Jung understood that symbols carry immense psychological energy. A symbol is not just a picture or a word, it is a doorway into the deeper layers of the psyche. When used deliberately, symbols can awaken truth, healing, and transformation. But when used unconsciously or worse, manipulatively, they can bypass rational filters and install beliefs, fears, and desires that do not come from the soul, but from the collective agenda. In this way, propaganda becomes a ritual of possession. The individual sees an image or hears a phrase repeated often enough, and soon it begins to shape their worldview. Not through evidence or logic, but through resonance with the unconscious mind. This is why Jung placed such high importance on individuation, the process of becoming conscious of one's own inner dynamics. He knew that a person who has confronted their shadow, integrated their inner contradictions, and listened to their deeper self is far less susceptible to being unconsciously manipulated. Such a person does not simply absorb public opinion or follow trends. They question, they discern. They ask, why do I believe this? Where does this emotion come from? Is this truly my conviction? Or have I inherited it from the collective unconscious? These are dangerous questions to a society ruled by mass psychology because they break the spell. They reintroduce the individual ego, the sovereign I, into a system that thrives on conformity and emotional uniformity. Jung warned that when the unconscious is not made conscious, it does not disappear, it dominates. In the context of mass movements, this domination takes the form of ideologies that appear spontaneous, but are actually archetypal in structure. They follow patterns: the messianic leader, the scapegoated enemy, the promised utopia, the cleansing violence. These are not inventions of modernity. They are ancient motifs arising from the depths of the collective psyche, and when people are unaware that they are living out myth rather than making conscious choices, they surrender their freedom. They become actors in a script written not by truth or justice, but by psychological inertia. The power of unconscious manipulation is also reinforced by emotional validation. In a crowd, emotions are contagious. The individual does not feel alone in their fear or outrage, they feel supported. This emotional consensus gives a sense of certainty, which can be intoxicating. Doubt, nuance, and internal conflict are cast aside in favor of unity and momentum. But this certainty is rarely grounded in truth. It is rooted in the unconscious need for belonging and safety. People begin to say things not because they believe them, but because those things make them feel connected. Over time, this emotional conformity replaces moral discernment. People no longer ask what is right, they ask what is acceptable. Jung believed that education and intellect alone could not protect against this. Even highly intelligent people are susceptible to unconscious manipulation if they have not done the inner work of confronting their personal shadow. In fact, intelligence can sometimes make it worse because it provides clever justifications for actions that are rooted in unconscious drives. The true defense against mass psychology is not more information, but more integration. It is the courage to sit with discomfort, to examine one's prejudices, to acknowledge one's capacity for hatred, fear, and aggression, not so that these energies can be indulged, but so that they can be transformed. The unconscious manipulation of the masses thrives in environments of fear and uncertainty. When people feel powerless, they become more willing to surrender their agency to leaders, slogans, or movements that promise clarity. Jung understood this and warned that societies must guard against the temptation to resolve complex problems through simple, emotionally satisfying answers. The unconscious always prefers simplicity over complexity because it is archetypal in nature. It works in symbols, not in systems. But reality is complex, and only the conscious mind, rooted in the soul of the individual, can navigate that complexity. With wisdom to resist unconscious manipulation, one must reclaim the sacred responsibility of self-awareness. This means cultivating silence in a noisy world, reflection in a reactive culture, and depth in a society that values appearances. It means refusing to be swept away by every wave of public emotion, and instead grounding oneself in something eternal and internal. Jung did not believe this was easy. He knew it was the path of spiritual maturity. But he also knew it was the only path that leads away from collective madness and toward true psychological freedom. Carl Jung observed that in moments of social upheaval, collective unrest, or moral panic, something far deeper than political opinion or public sentiment begins to take hold of the masses. Beneath the visible tensions of culture and society, unconscious forces stir, and among the most powerful of these are the archetypes. These universal psychic patterns, inherited and embedded within the collective unconscious, lie dormant until activated by certain conditions. When mass anxiety reaches a threshold, these ancient images awaken and rise to the surface, not as quaint symbols, but as overwhelming psychic energies that influence thought, feeling, and behavior. Jung warned that in such times, people no longer act merely as individuals, but as vessels through which archetypes express themselves. This activation is not always conscious. In fact, it is most dangerous precisely because it bypasses awareness and takes possession of the collective psyche. The archetype does not require logical persuasion or intellectual assent. It speaks the language of myth, emotion, and instinct. It appeals to something primal within the human soul. In the context of mass psychology, this means that a frightened or uncertain population becomes fertile ground for the emergence of archetypal roles: the hero, the savior, the martyr, the outcast, the villain. These are not mere metaphors, they are psychological realities that structure the way people perceive the world and themselves. When activated, the archetype organizes emotions, justifies decisions, and even rewrites personal memories in order to fit the narrative it demands. Jung insisted that we do not merely believe in archetypes, we are lived by them. This dynamic becomes especially evident in times of crisis. For example, when society experiences a profound threat, be it economic, biological, ideological, or existential, the archetype of the savior be projected onto a charismatic leader who suddenly becomes larger than life. This figure is not evaluated based on logic or policy, but on mythic resonance. People follow such leaders not because they are rationally convinced, but because something in them responds to the ancient pattern of redemption and deliverance. At the same time, the archetype of the shadow is projected onto enemies, dissenters, or minorities, any group that can be symbolically blamed for the crisis. These scapegoats become not just opponents, but incarnations of evil itself. In this psychic atmosphere, nuance collapses, and society fractures into good and evil, light and darkness, truth and heresy. But these are not conscious judgments, they are compulsions rooted in the archetypal realm. Jung was particularly concerned about how archetypes distort perception when they are not integrated. An activated archetype is not evil in itself, it is neutral, but powerful. If one is conscious of it, it can be channeled creatively. The archetype of the hero, for instance, can lead someone to face fear and pursue moral courage. But, if unconscious, it may lead to fanaticism, recklessness, or even violence. The same energy that inspires self-sacrifice can also justify aggression, in the name of a perceived higher good. Jung called this being possessed by an archetype, and he warned that entire nations can fall under such possession when the psychic tension is great enough. In such cases, individuals are no longer acting from the center of their own consciousness, but from a place of collective fantasy. The media, Jung understood before its digital evolution, plays a significant role in this activation. Images, symbols, and narratives broadcast across a population serve as conduits for archetypal energy. When certain motifs are repeated, such as the fallen hero, the threatening outsider, the apocalyptic crisis, they become internalized and begin to stir the archetypes within the collective unconscious. People begin to see reality not as it is, but as the archetype dictates. This is why debates become irrational, why fear escalates into moral panic, and why violence becomes justified in the name of peace. The psyche, when gripped by archetypal power, overrides logic, ethics, and individuality. One of Jung's most profound insights is that the archetypes are not limited to personal life. They shape history, revolutions, religious revivals, wars, and cultural renaissances are not only political or economic phenomena, they are psychic eruptions of collective archetypal content. In mass movements, the same archetypes that shaped ancient myths and dreams begin to play out on the stage of history. When a nation believes it must be purified, it is responding to the archetype of the baptism or the cleansing fire. When a society idolizes a single figure to deliver them, they are invoking the Redeemer. And when groups are demonized, imprisoned, or eliminated in the name of progress, the archetype of the sacrificial victim is being reenacted, often with terrifying literalism. Jung insisted that these forces cannot be eliminated by reason alone. The rational mind is a relatively recent and fragile development in human history, whereas archetypes are primordial and enduring. To confront them, we must not dismiss them, but recognize them, study them, and bring them into consciousness. This is the work of individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the contents of the unconscious into the conscious personality. Only by knowing the archetypes within ourselves can we resist being blindly led by them in society. Otherwise, we become unwitting participants in dramas we do not understand, tragic actors in myths that rewrite themselves through human behavior. In mass psychology, the problem is not simply that people act irrationally, the problem is that they act mythically without knowing it. They take up roles and beliefs that have less to do with current events and more to do with timeless patterns of the psyche. Jung warned that modern man thinks himself free of myth, but is in fact more governed by it than ancient man, precisely because he is unconscious of its presence. When archetypes are activated but unrecognized, they possess the psyche like gods once did, demanding allegiance and sacrifice. This is not merely a theoretical concern. The failure to recognize archetypal activation in the collective has led to real-world catastrophes. The rise of totalitarian regimes, mass genocides, cult movements, and ideological extremism are aberrations. They are symptoms of archetypes gone unchecked. Jung's analysis of Nazi Germany was a chilling case study in how archetypal imagery, blood, soil, the heroic leader, the pure nation, could stir a collective madness in an otherwise civilized society. He did not attribute this to individual evil, but to a psychic possession on a mass scale, triggered by collective insecurity, humiliation, and the failure to integrate the shadow. The hope Jung offered was not in eliminating these forces, but in illuminating them. Archetypes will always be part of the human condition. They are the structural skeleton of the psyche. But we have the capacity to bring them into dialogue with consciousness. This requires humility, introspection, and courage. It means recognizing that the enemy we fear outside may reflect the unacknowledged shadow within. It means acknowledging that the savior we seek in a leader may point to a deeper longing for integration and inner guidance. When archetypes are integrated, they no longer control us, they guide us, inform us, and enrich our journey. But when left unconscious, they turn history into tragedy and crowds into instruments of destruction. Jung called on us not to suppress the archetypal energies, but to become aware of them, to learn their language, and to understand the myths we live by. So, we can finally choose how we live them rather than be consumed by them. One of Carl Jung's most sobering observations was that mass movements tend to unleash the darkest, most unintegrated parts of the human psyche, particularly through the projection of the shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow represents those aspects of the self that are denied, repressed, or disowned. These are the feelings, desires, and traits that individuals and societies do not want to admit as their own. What happens in mass psychology is a kind of psychological transference. Individuals project their internal darkness onto external figures or groups, believing them to be the root of society's problems. The shadow, which is meant to be faced and integrated, is instead cast out and vilified. Jung warned that this process is not only dangerous, it is inevitable when consciousness is weak, and the tension between the individual and the collective is unresolved. In political movements, religious crusades, or ideological revolutions, this dynamic plays out with devastating clarity. People gather under the banner of moral certainty, believing they are on the side of good, justice, or truth. But this certainty is often fueled by unconscious fear and unresolved inner conflict. Rather than confronting their own aggression, envy, or prejudice, people attribute those qualities to others, outsiders, enemies, or dissenters. The group then feels justified in punishing or excluding the projected shadow. What feels like moral conviction is often a masked form of inner evasion. The more intensely the group sees evil in others, the less it sees within itself. Jung pointed out that the more unconscious a person is of their shadow, the more likely they are to encounter it in the outside world in terrifying and hostile forms. This phenomenon becomes amplified when individuals merge into the collective. The individual, isolated, might recognize moral ambiguity or inner contradiction. But in the crowd, these nuances disappear. People stop thinking independently and begin to act as a single, uniform organism, an archetypal mob. Here, the shadow is no longer personal, it becomes institutional. Propaganda, slogans, and rituals take on a religious quality, reinforcing the projection and justifying aggression. Whole systems are built to sustain the illusion that all darkness lies outside the group. This leads to scapegoating, persecution, and even violence. The collective mind, gripped by shadow projection, seeks purification through the destruction of the other. Jung saw this not only as a political issue, but as a deeply psychological one. The unwillingness to confront the shadow within is a form of spiritual immaturity. When people are not taught how to deal with their own darkness, they become vulnerable to mass manipulation. They seek relief from inner conflict by joining a cause that gives them certainty and a clear enemy. This is why Jung emphasized the moral responsibility of each individual to examine their own psyche. Without such inner work, even the most educated or civilized person can become an agent of collective destruction. The atrocities of the 20th century were committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people under the influence of unconscious forces, participating in systems that allowed them to project their inner shadow, do others with impunity. Jung's analysis of the rise of Nazism in Germany illustrates this principle vividly. After the humiliation of World War I and the collapse of national pride, the German people experienced a psychic disorientation. This created a vacuum into which archetypal energies surged, particularly the projection of the national shadow. Jews, communists, intellectuals, and others were demonized, not because of who they were, but because they symbolically carried the disowned aspects of German identity. The more the population was encouraged to see themselves as victims or moral agents of purity, the more ruthless and inhumane their actions became. Jung warned that this was not unique to Germany. Any society that fails to help individuals reckon with their own shadow becomes ripe for similar eruptions. Mass psychology thrives on the simplicity of binary thinking: good versus evil, us versus them, light versus darkness. This framework gives people a sense of purpose and identity, but robs them of complexity and responsibility. Jung argued that true morality does not come from identifying with one side of a duality, but from integrating both sides within the self. The shadow, when acknowledged and integrated, becomes a source of power, insight, and creativity. But when it is denied, it festers in the unconscious and eventually bursts forth in destructive ways. In mass movements, this denied shadow becomes a collective contagion, spreading through rhetoric, symbols, and shared narratives that glorify vengeance and justify cruelty. Jung believed that psychological projection is not limited to times of crisis or war. It operates subtly in everyday life, in media, in politics, and in religion. Whenever a group defines itself by what it is, not by what it opposes, hates, or fears, there is likely a shadow at work. This projection allows individuals to feel righteous without changing themselves. They fight external battles to avoid internal ones. The shadow can also appear in more subtle forms, such as moral superiority, intellectual arrogance, or spiritual elitism. In each case, the ego protects itself from discomfort by displacing the unacceptable onto others. Education, according to Jung, should include not only knowledge of the world, but knowledge of the self. It should teach people how to recognize their projections, how to deal with internal conflict, and how to accept the parts of themselves they find unpleasant. This is not a pleasant process. To confront the shadow is to admit that one is capable of the very things one judges in others. But this is also the beginning of maturity and wisdom. Only when we stop demonizing others can we truly take ethical responsibility for our actions. Jung said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." This insight has profound implications for leadership, governance, and culture. Leaders who are unconscious of their own shadows inevitably lead others into projection and scapegoating. Movements that do not address inner transformation will always seek external enemies. Societies that suppress dissent or complexity are often those most possessed by their collective shadow. Jung's warning is clear: if we do not face our own capacity for evil, we will project it onto others and call it justice. And in doing so, we not only harm others, we lose our own humanity. Jung also emphasized that integration of the shadow does not mean indulging it or acting it out. It means becoming conscious of it, taking responsibility for it, and learning from it. This is a process of psychological alchemy, transforming the base elements of the psyche into something refined and constructive. The shadow is not to be feared, but respected. It is the teacher of humility, the mirror of truth, and the guardian of authenticity. It keeps us grounded, honest, and aware of our limitations. But it can only do this when it is brought into the light of consciousness. In mass psychology, the stakes are even higher. When entire populations refuse to engage in this work, they become vulnerable to charismatic leaders, groupthink, and ideological possession. They trade inner conflict for outer conflict, projecting their disowned selves onto political enemies, social classes, or foreign threats. The result is a society driven not by reason or compassion, but by fear, denial, and vengeance. Jung's psychology, thus, not only a theory of the mind, but a blueprint for cultural and spiritual survival. It calls us to do the inner work that makes outer peace possible. It invites us to confront the difficult truths within, so we do not repeat the horrors of the past under the illusion of moral progress. ChatGPT said, "Ideological possession, as Carl Jung warned, is one of the gravest threats to the development of individual consciousness and the health of collective society. It occurs when a person's thoughts, beliefs, and even moral compass become entirely subjugated by a rigid system of ideas, often inherited from a larger group or movement. In such cases, the individual no longer thinks independently or questions what they believe. Instead, they become a mouthpiece for the ideology itself, allowing it to speak through them as if it were their own voice. Jung saw this not merely as a social problem, but as a psychological crisis, a collapse of the self into the inflated identity of a collective abstraction. The person possessed by ideology loses contact with the inner world, with nuance, and with the personal conscience, surrendering instead to the seductive clarity of absolute answers and the illusion of certainty. This phenomenon is particularly dangerous because it often masquerades as moral superiority. The ideologically possessed believe themselves to be righteous, enlightened, or chosen, not realizing that they have stopped engaging with reality and begun reciting programmed thought. Jung associated this kind of psychic state with inflation, a condition in which the ego identifies with a larger-than-life image of itself, often derived from an archetype or collective idea. The person sees their ideology not as one perspective among many, but as the ultimate truth. They cannot tolerate dissent or ambiguity, and they react to opposition not with curiosity or humility, but with hostility and defensiveness. This rigidity is a symptom of the unconscious attempting to fortify itself against inner chaos by clinging to an outer system of order. Jung saw ideological possession as a form of psychic colonization. The personal soul is no longer sovereign, it is ruled by borrowed beliefs. The individual's inner world becomes a battleground where foreign ideas dictate thought, emotion, and behavior. This leads to a loss of inner authority and a dependence on external validation. The person becomes incapable of original thought because they no longer engage in reflection or inner dialogue. Instead, they seek safety in groupthink, confirmation, bias, and social approval. This is why ideological possession often spreads so quickly. It offers psychological relief from the burden of personal uncertainty. It provides a false sense of clarity, identity, and purpose, especially in times of fear, crisis, or transition. One of the most troubling aspects of ideological possession is that it displaces the shadow. The possessed person no longer sees their own flaws or capacity for harm. These are projected onto the ideological enemy. Jung observed that ideologies often split the world into binary opposites: good and evil, progress and regression, enlightened and ignorant. In doing so, they create an illusion of moral cleanliness while avoiding the dirty work of self-examination. The more one is convinced of the wickedness of the other, the more one is blind to the darkness within. This process of moral projection is not accidental. It is the ego's defense mechanism against integrating the unconscious. By locating evil outside the self, the possessed person feels justified in acts of exclusion, condemnation, or even violence. Jung warned that entire societies can be swept up in this unconscious dance of projection and destruction, especially when ideologies are supported by state power, media narratives, or religious fervor. Jung believed that one of the key antidotes to ideological possession is the process of individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are. Individuation requires breaking away from collective identities and confronting the unconscious material within. It involves developing a personal relationship to truth, rather than outsourcing that relationship to institutions or movements. The individuated person does not fear complexity or contradiction. They understand that human nature is inherently paradoxical and that truth is rarely found in slogans. Such a person is less likely to be swept up in mass movements because they are grounded in an inner authority that cannot be so easily manipulated. They can engage with ideas without becoming consumed by them because they know that ideas are tools, not identities. Another symptom of ideological possession is a deep intolerance for ambiguity. Jung wrote extensively about the need for people to hold the tension of opposites, to live in the uncomfortable space where competing truths coexist. Ideologies, however, seek to eliminate this tension by reducing all questions to simple answers. They prefer dogma over dialogue, loyalty over inquiry, and certainty over doubt. This oversimplification is not a sign of strength, but of psychic fragility. It indicates that the individual or society is not strong enough to withstand the discomfort of psychological growth. Instead of facing inner conflict, they externalize it and demand conformity. Jung warned that any system which suppresses doubt or penalizes dissent is not psychologically healthy, regardless of how virtuous it claims to be. Jung's insights also shed light on how ideologies can become substitutes for religion. In the absence of spiritual connection or inner meaning, people often turn to political or social ideologies for a sense of transcendence. These belief systems promise salvation, community, and moral purpose functions that religion traditionally fulfilled. But unlike mature spirituality, which encourages inner transformation and humility, ideologies often demand obedience and external action. They do not ask the person to examine their own soul. They ask them to change the world. Jung saw this as a dangerous inversion. When outer reform is pursued without inner reform, the result is often tyranny disguised as progress. Without the inner work of integrating the unconscious, ideological movements tend to repeat the very patterns of oppression they claim to oppose. This is why Jung placed such importance on psychological awareness as a civic duty. In his view, the health of society depends on the psychological development of its members. If individuals fail to engage with their inner world, they become fertile ground for ideological possession. They are easily swayed by charismatic leaders, polarizing narratives, and utopian promises. They mistake collective emotion for personal conviction and confuse mass opinion with moral truth. This is not merely a failure of education or politics, it is a failure of consciousness. Jung believed that only by becoming psychologically literate can individuals resist the pull of the collective unconscious and maintain their integrity in a world saturated with propaganda. Ideological possession also affects how people relate to history. The possessed mind does not learn from the past. It rewrites it to fit the present narrative. Memory becomes selective, facts become fluid, and history becomes a tool of moral positioning rather than a source of wisdom. Jung warned that when societies sever their connection to historical reality, they become vulnerable to repeating old traumas. The collective shadow returns in new disguises, and the cycle of projection and persecution begins again. The only way to break this cycle is through the cultivation of individual consciousness and ongoing process of inner work, ethical reflection, and spiritual humility. Jung was not opposed to political engagement or social activism, but he insisted that such engagement must begin with the individual soul. Movements that bypass the inner work of transformation inevitably become ideological, machines dehumanizing, divisive, and destructive. The more people invest their identity in these machines, the less they are able to see reality as it is. They become blind to nuance, closed to dialogue, and hardened in their convictions. This is not strength, it is a sign of spiritual possession. Jung's message was not one of withdrawal but of responsibility. He called on each person to examine the forces at work within them before they attempt to shape the world outside them. In a time when mass movements dominate public discourse and ideological battles rage across every platform, Jung's warnings are more urgent than ever. He did not offer easy solutions, but profound insights into the nature of the psyche. He saw that the problems of the world are reflections of the problems within, and that true change begins not with conquest, but with consciousness. To resist ideological possession is not to abandon values or convictions, but to reclaim the sovereignty of the soul, to think for oneself, to feel deeply, and to relate to others not as enemies or allies, but as fellow travelers in the mystery of being. Mass psychology, as Carl Jung explained, represents not an evolution of consciousness, but a regression or return to earlier, less differentiated states of the psyche where the individual dissolves into the collective and abandons the burden of self-awareness. Jung saw this regression not as a neutral phenomenon, but as a threat to human freedom, maturity, and wholeness. When an individual becomes immersed in mass thinking, they cease to function as a complete and responsible self. Instead, they revert to archetypal modes of being, guided not by personal insight or conscience, but by primitive emotions such as fear, anger, and fanaticism. These emotions are easily triggered and rapidly spread in large groups, often erupting in ways that feel righteous or necessary, but are actually driven by unconscious forces. The mass mind prefers simplicity over complexity and certainty over doubt. Jung warned that this is a hallmark of psychic regression, a defense mechanism against the anxiety of individuation. In a group setting, people find refuge in shared beliefs, slogans, and collective identity. The individual no longer has to struggle with personal questions, wrestle with inner contradictions, or confront the ambiguity of truth. Instead, they surrender to the comfort of belonging and the illusion of clarity. This process is deeply seductive because it allows the individual to feel powerful without being personally responsible. They become part of something larger, but in doing so, they lose the very thing that makes them uniquely human: their capacity for self-reflection and moral discernment. Jung associated this regression with the activation of the collective unconscious. When personal consciousness is overwhelmed by collective emotion, the contents of the unconscious surge forward in archetypal form. People begin to act, speak, and think in ways that reflect ancient patterns: heroes and villains, martyrs and tyrants, saviors and enemies. These archetypes dominate mass psychology because they provide ready-made scripts for human behavior. Rather than respond to a situation with reasoned thought, the individual reverts to symbolic roles dictated by the unconscious. They may not realize they are playing out a mythological drama, but their behavior mirrors these ancient narratives. This unconscious enactment leads to polarization, tribalism, and eventually violence, all under the guise of moral conviction or social giustizione. Of the clear signs that mass psychology is a regression of consciousness is the loss of individual voice. In the mass, people speak in unison. They repeat catchphrases, align their opinions with the group, and avoid dissent for fear of being ostracized. Jung observed that this loss of individuality is not merely a social consequence, it is a psychological collapse. The ego, which is meant to serve as the center of personal consciousness, is flattened under the weight of collective identity. The person becomes a fragment of the crowd rather than a whole human being. This fragmentation is dangerous because it permits actions that the individual would never consider in isolation. Under the influence of mass psychology, people abandon their inner compass and adopt the group's ethics, even when those ethics are violent or irrational. This regression is often facilitated by mass media, which Jung did not live to see in its modern digital form, but anticipated in his writings. Mass communication amplifies emotional contagion, bypasses critical thinking, and reinforces collective illusions. It creates a feedback loop where people are constantly exposed to the same images, opinions, and narratives, leading to a homogenization of thought. Jung understood that the psyche needs time, silence, and solitude to integrate experience and develop insight. The relentless noise of the mass mind short-circuits this process, leaving people reactive, anxious, and disconnected from their inner life. In such a state, they are easy targets for manipulation, whether by political leaders, cultural trends, or ideological movements. Jung believed that the regression to mass psychology is not only a psychological failure, but a spiritual one. It reflects the soul's withdrawal from personal responsibility, a refusal to face the inner darkness, and a desire to escape into external causes. People trapped in mass consciousness often project their shadow to others, blaming them for the world's problems while denying their own complicity. This projection fuels cycles of hatred and division, as each group sees itself as morally pure and the other as irredeemably corrupt. Jung warned that unless the individual confronts their own unconscious, they will continue to externalize their fears and act them out on the world stage. This is why he emphasized the need for inner work, not as a luxury, but as a necessity for the survival of civilization. The regression of consciousness also manifests in the dehumanization of others. In the mass mind, people are no longer seen as individuals, but as symbols of a category: enemy, threat, obstacle. This depersonalization makes it easier to justify cruelty, exclusion, and control. Jung saw this as one of the most alarming signs of psychological decline. When we no longer see the humanity in those who differ from us, we are no longer truly human ourselves. The ability to recognize the other as a mirror of oneself is a hallmark of mature consciousness. Mass psychology, by contrast, thrives on division and depersonalization. It needs enemies to maintain cohesion. It survives by inflaming fear and resentment, not by fostering understanding or compassion. Another indication of regression: the reliance on charismatic authority. In times of psychological insecurity, people often seek strong leaders who promise order and certainty. Jung viewed this as a projection of the inner self onto an outer figure. The leader becomes a vessel for the archetype of the wise old man, the savior, or the warrior king. This projection can temporarily stabilize the group, but it ultimately leads to dependency and disempowerment. People defer their own judgment to the leader, believing that he alone has access to truth. This dynamic is inherently regressive because it reverses the individuation process. Instead of developing their own inner authority, people submit to external control, often with dangerous consequences. Jung's concern was not limited to political regimes or mass movements. He saw the danger of regression in any situation where people abandon personal responsibility for collective identity. This includes religious institutions, corporate cultures, social activism, and even scientific communities. Whenever the group becomes more important than the individual soul, regression is taking place. Jung did not call for the destruction of collectives, but for the elevation of the individual within them. He believed that only by strengthening personal consciousness could society avoid the pitfalls of mass psychology. This requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to stand apart, even to suffer alienation in the pursuit of truth. Path of individuation is not easy, especially in a world dominated by collective thinking. It demands that we question inherited beliefs, confront uncomfortable truths, and hold space for ambiguity. It asks us to engage in dialogue rather than argument, to listen more than we speak, and to see others not as extensions of a group, but as souls on a unique journey. Jung's vision was not utopian. He understood the darkness in the human heart, but he also believed in the transformative power of consciousness. He knew that when enough individuals awaken to their own depth, the collective itself can be healed. Mass psychology thrives in unconsciousness. It weakens when people become aware. The more we know ourselves, the less we need the crowd to tell us who we are. Jung's legacy offers a roadmap through the chaos of the modern world. He taught that the soul is not an abstract idea, but a living reality that must be tended, protected, and developed. When society forgets this, it regresses into madness, and individuals lose their way. But when even a few people commit to the inner journey, they become lights in the darkness, anchors in the storm. They remind us that beneath the noise of the mass, there is a still, small voice, the voice of the self, calling us to awaken, to grow, and to remember who we are. Carl Jung understood that in times of collective upheaval, the antidote to mass possession and unconscious conformity lies not in further polarization, but in the awakening of the individuated self. When the collective becomes emotionally charged, and archetypes rise from the depths of the unconscious to animate crowds, the greatest danger is not merely the social unrest, but the psychic disintegration of the individual within it. Jung emphasized that the person who has not taken the time to become aware of their own inner life becomes susceptible to identification with group ideals, ideologies, and movements that offer a sense of belonging at the expense of true identity. The individuated self stands in stark contrast to this. It is the self that has confronted its shadow, integrated its contradictions, and developed a relationship with the unconscious. This self cannot be easily swept into the chaos of mass psychology because it does not need the crowd to confirm its worth or direct its actions. The individuated person is anchored in their own inner reality. They are not swayed by the fear of rejection, nor are they compelled to prove their righteousness by silencing others. Jung viewed individuation not as selfish withdrawal, but as the moral obligation of every human being who seeks to live consciously, for it is only through the development of individuals that society as a whole can evolve in a healthy and meaningful direction. Mass psychology thrives on sameness and submission. The individuated self, however, dares to be different, to question, and to hold tensions that the collective cannot tolerate. This does not mean rebellion for its own sake, but a deep inner loyalty to truth, even when truth is uncomfortable or lonely. Jung described this as a spiritual stance, a kind of inner sovereignty that no political party or popular movement can grant or revocate or resist the pull of mass thinking. One must cultivate the capacity for solitude. Jung wrote extensively about the value of solitude not as isolation, but as a sacred space where the individual meets the depths of their own psyche. In this solitude, one encounters the unconscious, not just the personal unconscious filled with forgotten memories and wounds, but the collective unconscious where archetypes dwell. The process of individuation involves navigating these deep waters, confronting the inner figures that arise, and learning to listen to the quiet voice of the self. The self, in Jung's psychology, is not the ego, but the totality of the psyche. It is the center and circumference of our being, the divine image within us that longs to be realized. When an individual begins to live in alignment with the self, they become more than a product of their environment, they become a transformative presence within it. This process requires enormous courage because it often brings the individual into conflict with the group. The individuated self is not welcome in a collective that demands conformity. Speaking truth, maintaining one's values, and refusing to scapegoat others can provoke hostility. Yet Jung saw this confrontation as necessary. The person who refuses to betray their conscience becomes a mirror to the collective, reflecting both its potential and its pathology. Jung believed that such individuals carry the seeds of cultural renewal. They may not be loud or influential by worldly standards, but their psychic integrity radiates power. Their very presence challenges the unconsciousness around them. In times of crisis, these individuals serve as the soul's immune system, resisting infection by fear, hate, and mass delusion. The individuated self does not retreat from the world, but engages it with clarity and compassion. This engagement is not driven by ideology, but by inner necessity. Jung warned that when people act from a place of unconscious identification with a cause, even a seemingly noble one, they risk becoming tools of the very forces they wish to oppose. The individuated person, however, is aware of their inner motives. They have wrestled with their own darkness and are less likely to project it onto others. This allows them to act not from reactivity, but from insight. They are capable of holding paradox of seeing both the good and the evil in themselves and in the world. This psychological maturity makes them resilient and creative. They do not seek simple solutions to complex problems, but are willing to live with uncertainty while continuing to do what is right. One of the most radical aspects of individuation is that it places the burden of responsibility squarely on the individual. Jung did not believe that salvation could come from political systems, religious institutions, or social programs alone. While such structures are necessary, they cannot replace the inner work that each person must do. He saw the world's problems as reflections of unresolved inner conflicts. War, injustice, and oppression begin in the human heart. Until individuals become aware of their inner split between ego and shadow, persona and self, they will unconsciously project this split onto others, perpetuating the very cycles they wish to end. The individuated self breaks this cycle by withdrawing projection and taking ownership of the inner struggle. This act alone changes the psychic atmosphere around them. It creates space for dialogue instead of dogma, connection instead of conquest. Jung was particularly concerned with the ethical dimension of individuation. He believed that true morality arises not from obedience to external rules, but from a living relationship with the self. The individuated person does not need to be told what is right because they have developed a conscience informed by deep inner experience. This conscience is not rigid or punitive but flexible and wise. It takes into account the complexity of human life and guides action with humility. Jung contrasted this with the morality of the collective, which often becomes moralism a tool for enforcing conformity and punishing dissent. Mass psychology relies on moralism to justify its aggression. The individuated self, in contrast, acts ethically even when it is inconvenient or unpopular because it is rooted in truth rather than ideologies. This ethical foundation makes the individuated self a source of healing in times of collective breakdown. Jung believed that even a single individual who is fully conscious can tip the scales. Their presence interrupts the chain reaction of unconscious behavior. They bring awareness into situations clouded by projection and fear. They remind others of their own humanity simply by being authentically themselves. This does not mean they are perfect or free from struggle. On the contrary, the individuated person is acutely aware of their limitations, but this humility is part of their strength. They are not trying to dominate others or impose a vision of utopia. They are simply trying to live in alignment with what is real, both within and without. Jung's vision of individuation is ultimately a vision of hope. He did not believe in quick fixes or mass awakenings, but he had faith in the power of the individual psyche. He believed that each person carries within them the blueprint for wholeness, and that the realization of this wholeness is the most important contribution anyone can make to the world. This is why he called individuation the central task of human life. It is not a luxury or an indulgence, but a necessity. In a time when external voices grow louder and more divisive, the need for inward listening becomes urgent. The individuated self is the one who hears that inner voice and chooses to follow it, even when it leads away from the crowd. Strength of the individuated self lies in its integration. It does not deny the darkness, but includes it. It does not idealize the light, but lives in it responsibly. It is not immune to the pressures of mass psychology, but resists them through self-knowledge and discernment. This inner coherence allows the individual to act as a stabilizing force in an unstable world. They become less reactive, more centered, and more compassionate, not because they are superior, but because they have done the hard work of becoming whole. This wholeness is what the world desperately needs, and it can only arise one individual at a time. The individuated self is a quiet revolution, a living answer to the chaos of collective unconsciousness. It shows us that the true power lies not in dominating others, but in knowing oneself. And through that knowledge, the possibility of a more conscious humanity begins to emerge, not through mass movement, but through inner transformation that radiates outward, quietly shaping the world.